Good afternoon and welcome to a webinar on the economics of soil health systems on Nebraska farms. My name is Byron Rath, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Soil Health Institute Sustainability Specialist. The Soil Health Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit implementing a comprehensive approach to enhance and protect the vitality and productivity of soil through scientific research and advancement. Today's webinar is the second in a series of 9 state-based webinars on the economics of soil health systems presented by the Soil Health Institute with the support of Cargill. This research aims to address the most frequent question that we receive from farmers, landowners, and their advisors. And that is, what are the economics of adopting soil health practices and systems? To address this question, we interviewed 100 farmers across 9 states. And today we will be discussing the results from the 12 farms assessed in Nebraska. At the end of this webinar series on May 13th, we'll be releasing an aggregated fact sheet of all 100 farms assessed as part of this project. This project was not designed to be a random sample of all farmers and their economics, but instead to intentionally interview farmers who are successfully implementing soil health management systems so that we can understand the economics of those systems as compared to their conventional counterparts and share that information with farmers throughout the upper Midwest. Tomorrow, you'll receive a recording of this webinar and the fact sheet for the 12 farms assessed in Nebraska, and this information can also be found on the Soil Health Institute's website at soilhealthinstitute.org/economics. During the presentation, please enter your questions at the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and our speakers will address those questions in the last 15 minutes. So thank you so much to Cargill for their support of this work, and a sincere thanks to the farmers who agreed to be interviewed as part of this research. Without their participation and contributions, this work wouldn't be possible. So with that, I would like to introduce Mr. Ryan Ciroli, Global Row Crop Sustainability Director at Cargill, who will offer opening remarks and then introduce Dr. John Shanahan and Dr. Archie Flanders. So handing it over to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Byron. And thank you all for taking some time to join the webinar today. On behalf of Cargill, I would also like to offer a sincere thanks to all of the growers who so willingly offered to share their insights and their experiences to bring this study to life. And without their openness, this work would not be possible. I would also like to offer a thanks to the Soil Health Institute and for their leadership and their incredible knowledge to help us better understand the economic benefits of adopting soil health management systems. I really believe that this work is a critical question, right, that we need to better understand as we look at how to scale up soil health management systems around the globe. I'll reiterate just that to ask you as attendees that to submit your questions for the panel using the chat feature, and that you will receive the fact sheet after the webinar concludes, and a link to the recording on Friday. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Shanahan, who's an agronomist and manager of the Economic Assessment of Soil Health Project for the Soil Health Institute. John's career in the agronomy field has spanned both public and private sector roles, including positions at Colorado State University, USDA ARS, and more recently with Corteva. He has focused much of his efforts on developing and promoting the adoption of more sustainable crop production practices, including soil health and nutrient management solutions. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Archie Flanders, who is an agricultural economist with the Soil Health Institute, and Dr. Flanders will join John for the Q&A session to answer any questions you may have. So with that, I'd like to hand it off to Dr. Shanahan.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Ryan, and a special thanks to Cargill again for providing the critical support that provided to carry out this important project. Archie and I are just extremely excited today to share with you the results from this project involving the interview of farmers in Nebraska. As Ryan has mentioned, that this was part of a larger project involving 100 farmers across 9 states, and you'll see those states represented there on the map. You'll also notice that these farmers we want to say a special thanks, to reiterate that we want to say a special thanks to those farmers for sharing their experiences with us, because we really believe the results that they've shared with us will be very important in helping farmers determine how to move forward in terms of adopting soil health practices. So a little bit about the background of this project and why we conducted it. It was mentioned a little bit earlier by Byron, but I'll kind of review it again. We know from past research that soil health practices such as no-till and cover cropping can provide some very significant environmental benefits, including soil carbon sequestration, improved water quality, and a whole host of other benefits. We also know that these soil health practices can also provide considerable number of benefits to the farmers themselves in terms of reduced soil erosion, things like increased water infiltration, improved drought resiliency, better nutrient availability, and a whole host of other benefits associated with these practices. But farmers often ask us, when they're considering the adoption of soil health practices, what's the economics of adopting these practices? And so that's really the objective of this project, is to acquire the information to help the farmers make these decisions when they're trying to make the decision to adopt a soil health practice. So a little bit about our approach. In Nebraska, we sought and interviewed 12 farmers who had adopted these soil health practices, such as no-till and cover cropping. Again, we selected these farmers because we were interested in learning about the benefits these farmers had achieved after having adopted these practices for at least 5 years, because it's often seen in research plots that it takes some time before one starts to see the benefits associated with these practices. So that was the justification for pre-selecting our sample size. We interviewed these farmers to obtain their production information. We then took that information and calculated partial budgets to compare benefits and costs before and after the adoption of these soil health practices. And I'll just call your attention and refer you to our SHI website, where you can see a little bit more detail around these methodology. So again, the partial budget approach basically evaluates only differences between management systems that are involved in adopting a practice. So for example, before adopting no-till and after, those were the type of economic comparisons and information that was acquired. Recognizing that market prices vary and fluctuate over time, we use a standardized set of long-term average prices when calculating the revenue for corn and soybean production. And again, you'll see that kind of information that'll be provided in our fact sheets. We did not include USDA payments in our partial budget analysis, although many of the farmers indicated that they started out by using some of these payments to help offset up some of these upfront costs, and many of them mentioned they were very valuable as they were learning how and acquiring skill and how to apply soil health practices to their system. However, many of these growers had been in the system long enough, and those payments have an expiration date, so we did not include those payments into our partial budget analysis. So a little bit about the characteristics of the 12 farmers that we interviewed in Nebraska. You'll see they're located across for the most part, the eastern 1/3 to half of Nebraska, representing a nice variation in terms of the climate variation that one would see in Nebraska, from the cooler temperatures in the northern part of the state to the warmer temperatures in the southern part of the state, and the precipitation gradient goes from east to west. You'll see that there's quite a range in growing degree days available across the location where these farmers were interviewed. Also, I'll just call your attention to the number of acres that were devoted to corn and soybeans. Remember now, these are average values. So this is the average number of corn acres that the farmers had devoted to corn versus soybean. And you'll see that it's a little bit weighted more towards corn because some of the farmers were practicing some corn on corn rotation. However, for the most part, they did use a corn soybean rotation for most of their cropping systems. Also, just call your attention to the fact that some of these farmers had introduced wheat into the rotation, which we would say is an important part of a soil health system in terms of cropping system diversity. Also, really, maybe the most important piece of information in this table is the size of these operations. You'll notice that around the average size of these operations in Nebraska was around 1,500 acres, which is considerably larger than the average farm operation in the U.S. So the point being there is that these practices such as no-till and cover cropping, they can be applied to rather large and sizable operations. The next question then we asked the farmers then is, what percent of your acres had you devoted to, say, no-till in the various tillage practices, and also what percentage of their acres had they devoted to cover crops? So I'm going to just start with that first bar there, and so keep in mind again. Remember, these are the average number of percent of planted acres that these operations had devoted to no-till. So you'll notice here for the 12 farmers in Nebraska, 95 they had applied or devoted no-till to 95% of their acres. So a rather significant number of acres, percentage of their acres, when you look at the statistics that were acquired from the USDA recent survey of 56%, for example, in Nebraska, and at a national level, it's about 7% of the acres are devoted to no-till practices. The remainder 5% of those acres with these 12 farmers, they were using things like a strip till in lieu of no-till. Sometimes that was used to help them establish improved corn stands under cool and wet soil conditions. And none of the farmers that we talked to were doing any kind of intensive tillage. So all of them were using some form of reduced till or no-till practices. Also, I'll just call your attention to the percent of acres that these farmers had devoted to no-till. Again, well above the statistics that the USDA has shared with us in terms of in the state of Nebraska, in terms of 4% for acres in Nebraska devoted to no-till and 5% at the national level. So these farmers were definitely using a significant number there, applying no-till and cover cropping to a significant number of acres on their operation. So our next slide here is the actual partial budget table, and it's packed with a lot of information. And so what I'm going to do is try to spend a little bit of time visiting with you about and unpacking that information to explain a little bit more of the details. So the table is broken down into the partial budget analysis for corn and soybeans. So on the left half is corn, and the right half of the table is soybeans. And what I've done then is color-coded. What we've done is color-coded the table in terms of so, for example, when farmers adopted practices, there were some costs associated and benefits associated with adopting things like no-till and cover cropping. So you'll see that in this portion of the table here. And I'm just going to, in the same way on the right side of the table in terms of soybeans, benefits and costs. So you can kind of think of that, this is a balance sheet. So for example, we asked some questions about what sort of practices have they saved any fertilizer costs when using no-till practices or cover cropping. And you'll notice here that on average, now keep in mind, these are average numbers for the 12 farmers that we interviewed in Nebraska. And so they saw a benefit of almost $19 an acre in terms of fertilizer savings. They're compared to a little bit of additional costs for adopting soil health practices. And you'll see similar savings over here. Well, actually, the savings was much greater for corn, because oftentimes when they were using cover crops and no-till, they oftentimes mentioned to us that they would be saving fertilizer inputs like nitrogen. And of course, corn uses more nitrogen fertilizer, so you can maybe expect that they would see a little bit more savings associated with these soil health practices. Likewise, if a farmer was practicing no-till in their operation, you'll notice that there is a reduction in the costs or expenses associated with no-till practice, which you might expect there be. If they're doing less tillage, there's going to be less use of fuel, less labor. In fact, many of the farmers that we talked to mentioned that one of the reasons they adopted no-till practices on their operation is because they just had less access to labor. And so that was one of the major driving factors in terms of them adopting no-till in their operation. Another change in expense is associated with equipment ownership. And as you can imagine, if the farmers were doing less tillage, then you'd see some lower equipment ownership costs. And that applied across the board for both corn and soybean. So when you sum all those things up together, the total change in expenses for adopting no-till or soil health practices in corn was about $20 difference. So there was a savings in terms of cost associated with adopting soil health practices around $20 an acre, and was about $10 to $15 an acre for soybeans. So the next question that we asked the farmers in our interview was, had you seen any yield increases associated with adopting these practices? And so that question was asked of each farmer, and what they reported to us then was that on average, the corn farmers reported an average of around 12 bushels per acre increase in yield associated with adopting soil health practices. None of the farmers told us that they had seen any kind of a yield decline. And likewise for soybean, when we asked them the question about whether they saw an increase in soybean yields associated with these practices, they reported to us, again, remember this is an average of 12 farmers, around 4 bushels and 4.25 bushels per acre average yield increase. So when you multiply the price received, the long-term price received for both of these crops associated with soil health practices, adoption of soil health practices, we saw this sort of an increase in revenue. So when you add up all these values and numbers here, you're going to see that on average, the farmers reported to us that they saw a total benefit increase of $100 per acre in revenue for corn. Well, actually, the total increase in net farm income was $67.68 for corn, and was $48.97 for soybean. So you can see that on average, again, these are 12 farmers, they saw an increase in net farm income when they adopted these soil health practices. So now if we look at the distribution of change in net farm income across these 12 farmers, you'll notice that there's a difference in the changing increase for the various farmers, and like adopting various management systems, all farms have different results, and you'll notice here that some of the farmers saw a greater increase in net revenue associated with adopting these practices, all the way up to $185 an acre. But all the farmers were making additional income by adopting these soil health practices. And likewise for soybean, a majority of these farmers saw an increase of in a net farm income by adopting these soil health practices. Only one farmer reported a decrease in net farm incomes. So that sort of summarizes the economic benefits. Our next table here, we also asked these farmers questions around what other benefits did they perceive, or did they report to us in terms of other benefits associated with soil health practices. So as I mentioned earlier, about 75% of those farmers told us that they saw an increase in yield. 83% of these farmers indicated that they saw a reduction in fertilizer input costs. A majority of these farmers, over 80% of these farmers, mentioned that they saw an increase in crop resilience. And oftentimes that they would mention that after a rainstorm, there would be water captured by, for example, a cover crop present in the field, and that additional water saved there would carry them through some drought periods. Likewise, when it was extremely wet, that would remove some of the water from the presence of cover crops and things like that would help absorb water and also give them better access to field operations after significant rain events. We asked them questions about improved loan insurance terms. We also asked them their perception about improved water quality. This wasn't a question of them having measured water quality, but what they mentioned was oftentimes after significant rain events, they would see reductions in water runoff, and the water coming off the fields was much cleaner. So that was how that question was reported to us. They all felt that these practices were providing them what the license to operate going in the future. Many of these folks mentioned that these practices, they were using them because they felt like this is what was going to be necessary for them to continue operating going forward. We asked them the question about did they see increases in soil organic matter, and 80% of those farmers mentioned that they had seen an increase in soil organic matter during the time that they had been adopting these practices. I think it was on average around 1.5% increase in soil organic matter that the farmers reported to us. So just sort of wrapping up here and summarizing, again, just want to mention the size of these operations, around 1,500 acres. Those are rather sizable operations, indicating that things like no-till and cover cropping can be applied to large operations. 95% of these farmers were applying no-till and devoting no-till to those acres, and they were using cover crops on 47% of those acres. The soil health management systems that these farmers have been using on their operations has saved them around $25 an acre for corn and just a little under $10 an acre for soybean. And we'll just repeat again, the soil health practices increased the average net farm income around $68 an acre for corn and about $50 an acre for soybean. So if you look back and remember what we were talking about in terms of adoption of no-till and cover cropping in Nebraska, around 56% for no-till and around 4% for cover cropping. That's based on the USDA survey. If some of those farmers were to apply some of these practices, it's very likely that they could increase their net farm income. So I'll just close then by reminding everybody that our fact sheet will be available on our website here, and this is the Nebraska website fact sheet. So be looking for that on the Soil Health Institute website, and there'll be a recording of this presentation as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close and open it up for questions then.
All right, thank you, John. We do have some questions. If you have questions, please enter those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Looking at a couple that came in earlier in your presentation, John Gunner asks, of the farms in the West, so what percentage of the Western farms that you were interviewing that were dry land? So what percentage of the Western 3 farms that you mentioned were dry land, and did they practice cover crops?
That's a great question, Byron. So those 3 farmers were in the western part of Nebraska, but they were irrigated farmers. So, okay. But to the question, the farmers were using cover crops on some. I don't remember exactly what percentage of the acres that they were using cover crops, but I do know that those farmers had been using cover crops. But that may have been somewhat aided by the fact that they had access to irrigation.
Okay. Mark asks a question that I believe Archie had answered in the chat, but this is around specifically if we could go into more detail on the seed expense category. Vincent asked a similar question if we had a sense of the average cover crop seed costs and average cover crop planting costs. Archie responded, just for those that haven't seen it, that seed expenses were aggregated over all farms with and without cover crops, and that the final report that we expect to release in June will separate out those cover crop expenses. John and Archie, did you have anything to add to that, to the seed expense category question?
I don't know.
No, I don't have anything to add either.
Great. Okay, Mark also asks John about the yields. And so I think it's back to that table that you had earlier in your presentation, but what yields were considered average?
I'm just trying to advance. Well, so we did record their average yield on their farm, and that varied a little bit between the dryland farmers and the irrigated farmers. I don't remember specifically what the average yields were. So I don't know if I'm getting at, not sure if I totally understand the question, Byron, but maybe would you repeat it one more time?
The question is, what yields were considered quote unquote average as a means for comparison? I think if I were to, that's the only information I see on this question from Mark.
So I think if I understand the question, the farmers, we were asking the farmers if they observed an increase in yield associated with these practices, and so their yield, they value that they assigned was what they reported to us in terms of increased yields associated with soil health practices. So cover around 225 bushels per acre, if I'm remembering correctly, would probably be the average irrigated corn yield, and about 185 bushels per acre for the dryland or non-irrigated corn yields.
Okay. Jacob asks a question about the soil type. Do you know, John, the common soil type on these farms?
So the soil types, and I'm pretty familiar with the soils in Nebraska. So the soil types of east of Nebraska are on the medium to heavier textured soils.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dipesh asks, do you expect that for farmers complementing these techniques with other soil health management practices and conservation techniques, do you think that would further improve yields and cost reductions for farmers in Nebraska?
Yeah, I think anything. I mean, when you think about soil health management systems, I think it's a comprehensive package. We asked these farmers other questions around their soil health practices. Were they using the 4 R's, for example, of nutrient management? And we didn't report that in this particular table, but a majority of these farmers were using practices such as grid sampling, variable weight fertilizer application, split applications of nitrogen fertilizer. So I think it's always best to think about these systems in terms of a comprehensive package. It's just not it's not just one silver bullet that solves the problem.
Great. Dan asks, how did you separate the effect of soil health practices on crop yield from other practices? For example, like improved crop variety.
Right.
That we would expect to have a positive impact on crop yield.
Right. So we spent a lot of time when we asked that question, and we went over the fact that that the varieties are improved, that there are other practices aside from soil health practices such as no-till and cover cropping. So when we asked them to ponder that question, we wanted them to make sure that they were separating out the difference between those other technologies versus the soil health practice. And I should mention that in some cases, some farmers actually had some on-farm strips. As we talked to farmers across these 9 states, several of them mentioned that they had cover cropping strips placed in their fields where they were using yield monitor measurements to give us a value there. I mean, they were not. I mean, when it comes to tillage, sometimes farmers would have their fields broken up into till versus no-till as a way to make a comparison. That wasn't very often that was mentioned, but occasionally there would be some controls in their fields where because these are farmers or businessmen just and trying to make these decisions. And so many of them did do some of these type of comparisons in field. Not all of them, some of these, but on average, this is what they reported to us.
Charles asks about the comparison kind of component of this. And I think that, was it a comparison to the farm previously, or was it a comparison to that business as usual? So how did you establish that kind of means for comparison?
Great question, Charles. So the comparison that was made was we asked them, when did you transition from your conventional practice to your, say, no-till practice or cover cropping? And so that was the comparison we used. And many of these farmers, it's been a long time since they've been practicing no-till and doing compared to conventional till. In fact, in the Nebraska group, I think it was on average, these farmers had been doing no-till for 25 years. So oftentimes it was a little bit difficult for them to remember, but what we would ask them then, if they didn't recall, is we'd ask them to compare with their neighbors that are still doing conventional practices. And so we would ask them what operations had they eliminated compared to their farmers in terms of a no-till practice. So that was kind of how the comparison was made.
Great. Hannah asks an interesting question. So the 12 farmers that you surveyed differed from the general kind of Nebraska farming population in terms of rates of adoption.
Right.
And we'd addressed that. This isn't a random sampling, but we specifically identified these farmers who'd successfully adopted these soil health management systems. So her question is, how do those differences limit your ability to draw inferences about an average Nebraska farm versus these high soil health practice adopters? So phrased another way, are there characteristics unique to these 12 farmers that would drive profitability not expected on maybe an average conventional farm?
Great. So I'll take a stab at this, but we'll want Archie to kind of follow up on it too. So, I mean, these farmers, part of the reason we use our partial budget approach is because we didn't ask them for specific economic information. We just asked them to describe their operations, and we compare that to what their neighbors were doing. And so we're using published custom rates, for example, for tillage and things like that. So this is considered a pretty robust way to make an economic comparison, because we're not using their specific costs. In other words, some farmers large enough, they can purchase inputs and like pesticides and fertilizer at reduced prices. And so this approach actually is pretty broadly and robustly applicable to the neighboring farmers. And it's specifically why Archie chose this approach when we were considering various economic approaches. So in a lot of ways, we feel like this information can be used to persuade other farmers to adopt these practices.
Archie, do you have anything to add?
A good summary to what John just said would be that our method of analysis is comparing production practices, conventional till production practices, and soil health management system production practices. And we're not strictly comparing farm level economics, financial situation. So the results that we obtain from this approach would be something that could be expected to be applied on similar farms, on similar soil types. And the results just are not strictly limited to the farms in this small sample.
Great. All right. Simon asks, did these farmers give any indication as to how long they've been adopting these practices? So did this study take into consideration that those who've adopted practices for 10 years plus versus growers that have recently adopted practices? So what does that look like, John, in terms of rates of adoption or length of adoption?
Right. I mean, we have that information for each of the 100 growers, how many years they had been practicing these. I think it would be a little bit premature for us to make a summary based on this limited, like 12 sample size. It might be something we could look at when we aggregate all 100 interviews together. I think that's when we can start to draw some more broad-based conclusions around what we learned here.
And kind of a follow-up to that, John, Charles asks, if many farmers were practicing the system for 20 or more years, I guess how many years do we think it will take to achieve these economic results? Can we glean that information out of that aggregated research in June?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's something that we are very interested in pursuing. I would say that we didn't collect the kind of information here to answer that question very well, because essentially what we asked is, how does it compare to what you're doing 25 or however many years ago you were doing conventional practice? So we didn't follow the journey along the way, and so they wouldn't be able to tell us. Well, many of them shared that early on they had some I wouldn't say failures, but some challenges. I mean, that's where these government prices support value numbers came in, is that it helped them sort of incur some of those challenges that they faced early on. I mean, it's like when you switch to any new management system, there's a learning curve there associated with that, and so but we just don't have the information to find out how long do you have to be in the system before you start to see the type of benefits that we're reporting here. I think the way to think about these benefits is this is where you can get to once you're accomplished at soil health practices, but it is by no means the story of how things would start out for you.
And I think we see Stefan asks a similar question as Charles and related to Simon's. And I just think broadly, you all are recognizing maybe an area where there's a gap in looking at the economics of soil health management systems transition,
Yeah.
conventional to adoption, that 5-year
Right.
transition gap. We think that there's definitely a need for more research.
Yeah, I think the Institute has a lot of interest in being involved in that type of research and effort.
We could expand on that a little bit by
Yeah.
observing that if you're in conventional tillage and you go to no-till, the cost reductions from ceasing the tillage are immediate. You don't have the equipment expense, you don't have the fuel expense, you don't have the labor expense. Now, some of the other benefits do take longer, such as potentially increased yields, potentially decreased expenses related to fertilizer, and some other inputs do take longer, but the reduced expenses and the increase in net farm income due to ceasing tillage are immediate.
Great. Thank you, Archie. Okay, well, thank you, John. Thank you, Dr. Shanahan. Thank you, Dr. Flanders. Thank you, Ryan. And thank you to all the farmers who participated in this research. We're at the conclusion of our webinar. If you have additional questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us at info@soilhealthinstitute.org. You will receive an email tomorrow with links to the Nebraska fact sheet and a recording of this webinar, as well as a survey to help us improve future webinars. So thank you all for attending today. If you have a minute when you close out your browser, a survey will appear if you would like to help us out in just answering a few questions as part of a quick 2-minute survey to help us improve future webinars. So thank you all. Have a great afternoon.